three things. First, we're going to talk about globalization, and we're going to cover two aspects of globalization, history, and then the discontent of globalization, which has been kind of a hot topic since about the year 2000 in the late 90s. The second thing is we're going to look at trade patterns in the international system, and we're going to look at how the shipping industry is developing. And the third thing that we're going to look at is regionalism as a phenomenon and whether and how it impacts world order. So, to get you started, we're going to get into globalization, its history, and its discontents. So when you talk about globalization, it's usually fairly hard to be specific in terms of what you're talking about. So there are lots of people who would tell you that globalization has been around for thousands of years, and it's actually something that we can classify as being ancient or being ongoing. And then you have people that would talk about modern globalization. So that would be globalization in the past 60 or 70 years. So it's a concept that is disputed in terms of the time frame that it takes. But as a term, the word itself, globalization, is something that we started using quite recently. So the first time it appeared in a text, in any text, this word itself, was in 1930. And it was a text about education. So it was referring to the globalization of education, which is something that I'm sure you can reflect on. Even us having that session at the moment is actually a part of the globalization of education in some ways. And then gradually in the 60s and the 70s, some scholars started to use it in the social sciences. But it wasn't really a popular term back then. So it was nothing like now. There was barely anybody using the word globalization. And then you hit the 80s. And in 1983, you had a scholar that started talking about the globalization of markets. And that's essentially what pushed globalization into the mainstream discourse and into popularity, and how it entered the economic discourse. So from that moment on, what we started to talk about mostly when we say globalization was really economic globalization. Before that, it was used quite sporadically. And after that point, economic globalization was really what took central stage in the academic discourse. Now, apart from economic globalization, you should keep in mind that it has different dimensions. You have cultural globalization, political globalization. You have different aspects that you can think about. But what we're going to talk mainly about today in the first part of the session is economic globalization. So when you look at different definitions of globalization, there are hundreds of them literally, and they differ quite substantially. So some of them, one of the economic-minded scholars on the board would talk about economic globalization as the increasing interdependence of world economies as a result of the growing scale of cross-border trade of commodities and services, flow of international capital, and wide and rapid spread of technologies. So this is, for instance, quite a positive view on globalization, a definition of the term. Now, there are other people, like Martin Kohr, who was president of an organization of what they call third world states, who thought of globalization as something that is similar to colonization in terms of history. So you can have completely opposite views on the phenomenon. One person is looking at it in terms of a rather positive light, somebody else is looking at globalization as means of oppression, essentially. And then you also have other scholars that refer to the beneficial aspects of globalization and refer to the idea of interacting to mutual benefit. So when you have definitions like that, and when you have words like benefit, you always have to think whether this definition is helpful and how you can use it. So if you have the word benefit, what is mutual benefit? Does this mean equal benefit, or does this mean that we both benefit, but one benefits more than the other? And how so? So when you are thinking about academic definitions, you need to always keep in mind the use of subjective words and how it might affect the definition and potentially its use. you obviously have all sorts of other definitions as well. One of them that seems fairly useful academically is a much more specific one. And it was proposed by Cox, who names specific trends and factors to globalization. So he talks about the internationalizing of production, the new international division of labor, new migratory movements from south to north, the new competitive environment that accelerates the process, and the internationalizing of the state. So if you break that definition down, what you're going to get is a number of bullet points that you can specifically use to evaluate globalization according to this criteria, for instance. And then you also have definitions from political science. So some people think about globalization as the compression of time and space, so that's much more philosophical, and it has implications for things like the nation state and how it develops. Now, based on these different definitions, so far, it seems unclear whether we have a force or whether we have a debate on what globalization is. Because if you're not sure what you're debating, then you're not really sure if you have a force that's established or whether you have a discussion. But either way, there is a very long list of definitions in Al Rodden's paper.